Tonight's guest is Nick Tobier. I became familiar with his work visiting Ann Arbor, Michigan, seeing his work, being really inspired by what he was doing in his own individual art practice and his community art practice. Let me read a brief bio about his work. Nick Tobier is an associate professor at the Penny Stamps School of Art and Design, the University of Michigan. He has two rather incredible titles that define what he does in the art and design department. One is the Detroit Faculty Engagement Coordinator. The other is the Senior Counsel to the Provost on Civic Engagement. From 1996 to 1998, Tobier studied landscape architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and subsequently he worked in professional practices at the Landworks Studio in Boston and the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation and the Bronx Division as a designer. He served as the project manager for Storefront for Art and Architecture, writing critical essays, facilitating public projects, and coordinating international competitions as he conducted broad-thinking explorations of architecture and urban space beyond expected function. A native New Yorker, Nick Tobier is a participant observer of street life and the social life of public places. These inherently layered scenarios are at the core of his work, and Tobier's practice and pedagogy reflects his belief in the power of social dynamism and fundamental role of the artist-designer as the catalyst and conduit in this relationship. He is also the author of a series of critical and speculative writings on design, city space, entertainment, and forms of public interruption as radical social strategy, including with Julian Stiegel, the forthcoming book, which he just finished editing, called Utopia Toolbox, which is coming out later on this year. I was very intrigued with Nick's practice when I visited Ann Arbor last spring, when he told me about the community art program at the University of Michigan called Detroit Connections, which he's going to talk a lot about tonight, along with his individual practice. I was really humbled and inspired by his work, that program's work, his persona, which just seems just so generous and with an ego removed, just about doing art to make communities and the world better, with still understanding the race, class, and gender dynamics that go into this work. Nick has had a busy schedule here in Milwaukee. MARN, Milwaukee Artist Resource Network, has been hosting him last night and today for studio visits. So we're lucky now to have him present tonight to us at Arts Now. So Nick Tobier.
Okay, sorry, those of you who I talked to the back of your heads. And those of you who I turn my back to. I'll turn, hello everybody, hi. Do you keep the lights like this, or what do we do? I feel like I should sit here amongst you all. I feel like I'm wandering. We do. No, if I sit behind you and talk, is that just totally weird? And you guys over here,
We're going to have to make do.
All right, let's do it, okay.
This is all Walker's.
Can we get some mood lighting? What happens here? Dim the light? No, okay. All right, well, hello again. Okay. I feel like, could I go over there and you press the, no, but Anne can do it. Is that okay? That way I don't turn my back. Okay. I'll make this motion. Don't misread it for anything else. Okay. Hello again. Thank you, snowy night. Thanks for coming out. I know some of you are in a class, so you have to come, so thank you too. All right, so this is where I grew up. In New York, this is the same street that my mom grew up on. This is, for better or for worse, the street that we moved to when we lived on the street that my dad grew up on in the Bronx, when my parents decided that that neighborhood was no longer viable to send their children to school in, so they moved here. And at the time I was growing up, the neighborhood that I lived in, my parents would describe as like a gap-toothed smile. There were vacant lots and standing buildings, but there were more gaps than teeth at that point. Okay, next slide. This is also where my hair grew up. I didn't know that you could get a cut, and my mother liked it. And because my hair was sort of airborne and bright, it would cause people who I didn't know to yell things to me on the street, like, yo Lucille Ball, or Ronald's in the house, or sort of quite often, yo big head. And it created for me a sense of public persona that I didn't have any agency in, and I didn't like it. I felt vulnerable, and I recognized that the environment around me was something that felt hostile, and I really wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. Next slide, please. Oh, should I go like that? I can go like that. I took the subway to and from wherever I was going at a pretty young age, and at that point, the New York City subways were so covered in graffiti that you couldn't quite see where the doors were. So you had to wait for the doors to open, and you'd sort of hurl yourself into the interior that was covered in a different type of graffiti. I had read as a college student in an art history class that the New York City graffiti in the late 80s was a manifestation of the hostilities of urban youth who resisted their environment by manifesting their visual hostilities upon it, because without viable art programs in the schools, this was the only outlet for creativity. Next slide, please. I had a 110 Instamatic camera, and for those of you who's Instagram, it's basically you would use film, and you take it to the drugstore, and it would come out with these rounded corners and this cool effect. And I would take pictures. This is something my Uncle Dave had given me, this camera, which in some ways was some first indication that he valued me as a creative individual. But this is one of my favorite pictures from that time. I love the expression on that guy's face who's looking over at the hot dog, who's either saying, oh, that's disgusting, or give me a bite. But the guy eating, you can see just above the guy eating, and I love this guy staring at me because he knows that I'm taking pictures. There's a sign that says no. And the first thing it says is no radio playing, which is before the iPod, sort of a boombox day. It says no eating. But it's so covered in graffiti you can't see all the instructions. And then underneath it, it says no photography. So yeah, I understood the city around me as a fairly chaotic and lawless place. And as I mentioned, I wanted to get out as soon as possible. Next slide. Oh, ding. It says friends down. I feel like I should pull the screen down a little. There was a hot dog man who, up until recently, was at the corner where I would take the subway, Petros Zarahalos, who was from the island of Ikario in Greece. And he knew everything. He knew who was coming and who was going in the neighborhood. And he'd tell me my father was home or my sister had walked the dog. And I remember once he sort of whispered to me, he said, hang in there, big head. And I understood that there was someone rooting for me in certain ways. But he represented a really important figure for me, as not only in how he conducted his business from the cart, that he was not behind a store counter or distant in any ways, but that he was what I would describe as a familiar stranger in the neighborhood. He's someone everybody knew and who knew everybody, and he was a great intermediary between me and a city that seemed giant in a smaller way. So, and I've said this a couple times now, I wanted to get out as fast as possible, and this is something I think a lot about in my teaching and my work in Detroit schools, and my understanding of how we think of education. I understood from school that the way to succeed was to get out, that success meant leaving where you grew up. And when we start to think about our schools and the best and the brightest or the most creative as going somewhere else, we see a sort of a cycle in our communities that says, this is the directive, to go and leave and perhaps never come back. And that was certainly what I wanted to do. I went to college, and I used my education as my sort of understanding of how I escaped. And I made all these metaphors for things that I had. I was a history and art major. I remember making this and describing it as analogous to like a fortified apartment building where there was like one lonely window that could look out and fortified against the street. But it didn't help me feel any less lonely or any less vulnerable. In many ways, for lack of better judgment, I went home after I graduated and I worked for my grandfather's smoked fish business. When I was a kid and I asked my grandfather what he did, he said he smoked fish. I pictured that, but it's like smoked salmon and things like that. So he was a tough guy. I worked with him at the Fulton Fish Market, and he gave me a corner of the warehouse where we hauled ice as a studio, and I would use shipping pallets as my material, sort of take them apart and build things. And living in the city, which was sort of variously chaotic and interesting, and trying to be an artist, and I built what I describe as the smallest possible apartment, So it's 1 feet by 4 feet by 6 feet. There's space to read, a little storage, and a space to sleep on top. And it was obviously somewhat parasitic that it needed another place for it to be. But I had this vision that if we could live in a smaller unit, then we could share more resources. And it's still something I think quite a lot about when I think of our conception of space and how we want to use it. I was walking, so I've already described that I worked for my grandfather's smoked fish business, so you have a vague understanding of what my social life must have been like at the time. I'd work at night, and I would come home smelling like fish, so it was perpetuated somewhat of a lonely existence. And I was walking home, and I had to stop because there was an elephant walking in front of me. And really, honestly, for the first 20 seconds, I thought, oh, crap. Now I got to wait here for this elephant to walk by. And then in the next second, I thought, oh, my God, there's an elephant walking by. And I looked down the tunnel, and there was other animals walking by, and all these people staring and clapping. And I thought, this is the most amazing street corner. I've never walked down this street before. And in that moment, before I knew that this was an annual event where Ringling Brothers parked their trailers on the other side of the Queens Midtown Tunnel because they were too big to make the turn, they'd marched the animals through. All those people knew about it. I thought I was just coming upon this unbelievable street corner. Behind the elephant was a guy with a bucket and a shovel, and he got this amazing round of applause. And I love that. And the elephant, for me, was, I think, one of the biggest shifts in my work. I thought it was important to put these in because it was at this point that I really gave up my studio because I recognized the things that I was making in that studio were determined by the studio. I had a chop saw and a jigsaw, and I had material, and I was going to go in there and I was going to make wood sculpture things. But they were way less interesting to me than the world around me. And I recognized that for me, studio was sort of the trap, sort of the expectation of doing these things. So I gave up the studio, and I decided that I was going to respond to whatever was happening around me, and I was going to use whatever was at my disposal. This is fairly sort of typical New York winter scene when the snow melts. There are these giant lakes that form around the catch basins where the water should drain down to the sewers, but there's no room for it to drain to. So you'll see people walk way around it or leap over a puddle or something. So I built a bridge to help people cross puddles. And I stand in the middle of a pontoon. I had this blue shirt on and a hat. I thought I looked municipal and official. And some people would say, oh, I can't believe the city's finally doing something about this, which I thought was so touching that there was anything remotely official with it. But I also recognized in my interactions with Petros at the corner, some of the things that I valued in my life as an individual were missing in my life as an artist. So I wanted, in most ways, not only to think of my work as somebody else's elephant, that you would see something and you wouldn't know how to categorize it, and it might change your understanding, say, of the next street corner where there might be a puddle bridge or an elephant walking by, or at least I would have a different interaction or conversation with it. This is a long-lost image from that pre-Instagram era of the bridge dreaming someday of becoming a great bridge. The base of the Brooklyn Bridge, the humble puddle bridge, figures it will cross the world. The guy standing on top of that table there is Chef Leon, who in the 20s through 40s ran the restaurant at the Hotel Edison. Cafe Edison just closed this December. December 31st was their last day. And at the time when he ran the kitchen, the hotel was really known for their soufflés, which I guess were light and fluffy. I've never made one, or eaten one. But he would take his kitchen staff up to the roof every day, and everybody would stand with their whisks, and they would jump. Because if they were feeling light and fluffy, so would their work. And I love the combination of that type of exuberant calisthenic, the pride in the tool of the whisk, and the uniform that signifies what they're doing. So some of the projects I'll show you are informed by this very sort of specific interest in the overlap between everyday work and celebration. So the elephant walking through was celebratory and fantastic, and the guy with the bucket was shoveling elephant shit. He was not the star attraction. And the chefs and their whisks were doing something that was perhaps appreciated, but their names weren't attached to it. I think this one's been like 2008. I was invited by Muni, which is the bus company in San Francisco. They invited 12 artists to do projects on the buses. And it became very clear almost as soon as I got there that what they were asking the artists to do was to create things that would occupy the space of the ads up there. Photographs or prints or things that could take up the space that art took up in a certain sense. And I asked if I could do something else instead. And through a somewhat of a negotiation process, I wanted to be a bus ambassador. I had been on an Amtrak train and I had been on a plane, and on the plane I'd always walk past first class and I'd see people sitting in these big seats and they had a real glass with a real drink in it, and I'd go back to coach and I'd sort of fold myself into steerage. But I recognized that there was a great privilege in even being able to fly, and that privilege of travel and ceremony is extended to those who can afford it. And that bus travel doesn't afford that. That most often in this country, if you're riding public transportation, you're either doing it because that's all that you have available to you, and you're not doing it with a great deal of ceremony or grandeur. So I appointed myself as a bus attendant for the 22 Fillmore bus. If any of you know San Francisco, I didn't really know it at the time, but I asked people, what's the bus that crosses the most complex swath of the city? 22 Fillmore, if you look at the bus route, goes from sort of the wealthy Marina district through the Mission into this area known as the Dog Patch. And so every morning I would walk the entire route of the bus stop, and I'd clean up everything that was there. It would take me a couple hours, and I'd greet passengers who over the month I was doing this, I came to know and they came to know me. And then I would ride on the bus with that thing on my hand, which I call my puffy. And I would buff the seats and clean them and greet people. And I knew all the drivers on my route. And I think there might be one more image in here. Yeah. I'd wave and run, and I'd really work hard at this. And some autobiographical note, after I worked as a doorman in Philadelphia for a couple of years, so I was really accustomed to the white glove treatment and the uniform of changing these gloves every 2 hours in this sort of San Francisco summer. Shortly after I did this project, Muni hired 8 what they call bus ambassadors. And I do know, quite frankly, that it was from some agitation caused by this. The bus ambassador's job largely is to prevent teenagers from writing graffiti on the bus. But I understood it as a sort of a disruptive gesture by an artist to change some of the city infrastructure. Next slide. I did go to, at a certain point, I understood for myself that I was interested in city space and how an artist/designer could affect it. So in a very misguided sort of autobiographical or career step, I went to graduate school to try and professionalize myself. I would caution any of you who are thinking of it of not doing it for that reason. So I went to graduate school at a fairly hostile design school, and I studied architecture and landscape architecture in an environment that was really competitive and quite unpleasant. And this is what the school looked like. Next slide, please. And I went into professional practice, and I don't have any images of that because sometimes that work depresses me. But I remember the last job that I did. Is anybody here besides you from Massachusetts? Oh, so we're safe, okay. All right. So I worked on a job in this town called Oyster Ponds in sort of Cape Cod. Marvin Glick, does anybody know him? No? You do? You know Marvin Glick? Do you? Oh, you do? Well, anyway, so we built a $15 million house. And when I say $15 million, I didn't get $15 million, but that was the construction budget, and it included a $500,000 heated driveway. So when the owner of this house in the winter wanted to drive his Porsche, he could flick a switch on in the garage, and the snows would magically melt. And I was really proud of myself for having figured this out. But at that point, I knew that there was far more to what I wanted to do in terms of affecting space than work on $500,000 heated driveways. I still work with the firm that I worked designing that. It's called Landwork Studio. And most often what I do is work on competitions with them. This is the High Line in New York. If any of you ever watched Law & Order, this is where they used to find dead bodies. But if you've gone to New York recently, this is sort of like the sort of Uber tourist destination in Chelsea. It was a former elevated rail line that served as freight on the far west side, and it was abandoned and then turned into I'd say a park for the sort of affluent tourist classes. And they had a competition to redesign it, and we entered it. We didn't win. Next slide, please. But I was really pleased with our entry. And when so it proposed a need for a far west side transit link along with a roller coaster. So combining the logic of, say, island with some fantastical travel along with practical travel and hooking into it. There were existing transit systems. It's when Robert Hammond, who's the director of the Friends of the High Line, or founder of it, talks about the process, he uses this project to describe it as the most far-fetched idea, which I'm very proud of achieving that. Next slide, please. And it also, I snuck in this. It offered an elephant shuttle to get from the High Line over to the 8th Avenue subway. Next slide, please. I spent 4 years in Alfred, New York, where I taught at this great little school called the New York State College of Ceramics. On October 6th, my first year at Alfred, this happened. There was this amazing snow and ice storm that kicked out everything. Power for 5 days, and all the leaves on the trees disappeared. And so if you think today was gray here, you had nothing on your hair over here. Next slide. So this was my first intervention into the Alfred rural Western New York landscape. It's an upholstered and embroidered tent that serves hot chocolate in the middle of Main Street. It's a small town, so this police officer here, who is now the mayor, by the way, is getting one to go. And I was really, it was interesting to having come from growing up in a big city to live and work in a small town. Next slide, please. The things that I build as I guess, I would always describe myself as a sculptor still, but I understand the sort of language of building as something that I can achieve with my hands and sort of send out into the world. But this is much more recent. This is a tricycle-driven chandelier. So I transfer the power that would normally go into hub generators that would power your headlights or taillights to power the chandelier above my head. So when I pedal, the lights go on, and when I don't pedal, they don't go on. So that's a design flaw. And cut this sort of beautiful crystal light through sort of neighborhoods in Detroit where there is no viable street lighting. And we can talk more about that. But what it does as a beacon in a dark neighborhood is really significant. So next slide, please. There's someone peeking out the window over there, looking at me and closing her window shade shortly after it. Someone threw a pizza slice at me, which I took as some kind of sharing, or I like to think it. So next slide, please. Because of the sort of landscape background, and I work for the Parks Department, and I've done a lot of sort of community-based work. And I was telling some people earlier today that one of the things we most often had to do in the Parks Department was turn a section of street into park like that. So the Parks Commissioner would call and say, the corner of 215th Street and Broadway in the Kingsbridge section of the Bronx is going to be a park. And I'd say, when? He'd say, Friday. Can you do some research on the neighborhood? Can you get some community people to come out and support the project? And we'd go very, very fast. And I'm amazed that any of those parks are still standing in some ways. But I was invited by the University of Michigan to work with the city of Ann Arbor to create a welcoming gateway to the city. So Nicholas, you may remember South State Street, where people get off I-94 to come into town. There's no big sign that says, welcome to Ann Arbor or welcome to the University of Michigan. In fact, the first sign you see is this. It says, permit only, no RVs allowed, no cash sales, cars without a permit will be towed at owner's expense. I thought, what a crappy welcome. And so my suggestion right off was, well, let's move the marching band practice site from a side street to this lot. And so when people come into town, they'll see a marching band and they'll think, what a great, happy place. Next slide. And the mayor said, ha, 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 that's so silly. And I said, no, I'm not kidding. So the city funded a project for what's called the Maize and Blue Mile, and I'm proud to say it's the most boring project I've ever completed. It involves seasonal maize and blue school color plantings that look like weeds most of the year. And it just goes to show you that if you let it happen, the triumph of dull bureaucracy will win over our visual environment, and you cannot let this happen. And I didn't want to let it rest at that. Next slide, please. So I formed my own marching band. I put a sign up at the music school, and I said, looking for, I think I might have said looking for marching band, but there was some fatal flaw in my poster. So I recruited a group of music school students, and I made these uniforms that were strategically not maize and blue or high school colors or Eastern Michigan or any type of affiliation with some greater institution. I was very proud of these. Next slide, please. There we are. and I was the drum major because I don't play an instrument well enough to do it publicly. The guy at the back is Elon Morgenstern, who before he was a graduate student in trombone was the lead trombone player for the Tel Aviv Brigade of the Israeli Army Marching Band. And it's really hard to negotiate with a recent Israeli Army veteran about what you want to do and when you want to rehearse. So I'd say, let's rehearse on Thursday, and Elon said, I don't rehearse on Thursday. I rehearse Sunday morning. So we would rehearse on Sunday mornings, and we would play strategically for cars coming into town, either commuting or coming in on a time when they weren't noticing. Next slide, please. I also, as I said, there was a fatal flaw in my poster, so I forgot to ask if people could walk and play their instruments at the same time. So for the first week, we were a standing band. A standing band sounds way less groovy than a marching band. On the next slide, there should be a video, so just let it. In Toronto, we were just talking about, the city of Toronto in the 30s built a series of these wading pools in immigrant neighborhoods for use in the summer when I guess people who are living in overcrowded conditions might get agitated and cause trouble. So it was a way to cool off masses in cities where there wasn't a good air circulation. And they still exist, and they're beautiful in certain ways, and they're strange in another way, because if you've been a bad student in high school, you are punished by one of your options for doing your penance is to work at these pools in the summer. So again, I had this opportunity to do a project in a city where I don't live, and the site were these wading pools, and I asked if I could meet the people who worked in the pools. They said, these are really bad kids, you don't want to talk to them, but I really wanted to talk to them. And I asked what their day was like, what they did, and how they what their fears were, what their aspirations were for their work and for their lives. And some of the things that I really took away from our first meetings were they spend a lot of time trying to avoid their supervisor. And if a dog comes into the pool and pees, they have to clear everybody out and bleach the water. And we talked about clearing the leaves, and this is when the video may or may not come up. Go to this next slide. Oh, yeah. So I was thinking, some of the precedents for this that I was really interested in were like Busby Berkeley movies, if any of you have ever seen like $1 Million Mermaid or Gold Diggers of 1939, things that turn the tasks of everyday work into some type of beautiful ceremony. And Busby Berkeley, when he was in the Army, was responsible for choreographing big military spectacles. But I was also influenced by groups like this with the Red Rockets, who were German factory workers in the 1920s, who after their shifts would show up on the street corners and agitate for people to do exuberant calisthenics based on their daily tasks in the factory to subvert the tools that oppress them and turn them into celebration. So I wanted to do something similar with the teenagers and students who variously worked in the pool. So let's see if this will work. So when I mentioned before that I understood my education as a way of getting out of the world, I think a lot about being a teacher and being a teacher in my multiple roles. One is using my position at the University of Michigan to work with what I would describe as largely affluent, privileged students to understand the privilege that comes with education, and in some ways to turn that privilege inside out, or at least to examine it pretty significantly. And before I got there, like 1998, one of our MFA candidates wanted to teach a course with a Detroit public school and needed a faculty advisor. It was my colleague, Janie Paul. And Janie passed the class on to me, and at first what we did was carry on that legacy, which was to do art workshops in a public school that didn't have an art teacher or an art curriculum. And I recognized that as wonderful as the experiences were within the classroom, the world that affected those students outside the classroom was not dissimilar to the world that I had grown up in, which was that it was a hostile environment that sort of resisted the creative child and in many ways, the thing that was at odds between the classroom and the world outside was fairly extreme. Next slide, please. This is, for instance, the closest place to get food from that school. So it's Marcus Garvey Elementary on the east side of Detroit, where it's one of the many food deserts in the city, and perhaps there are similar questions that are faced here in Milwaukee. Food desert roughly is anywhere that someone lives where they have to travel more than a mile to buy food somewhere, to procure food other than from what's described as a fringe retailer, a convenience store, a liquor store, a gas station that sells some food. So I started backing up and understanding for both my own practice and the work I did with students, some of the sort of critical creative environment that informed the school. Next slide, please. This is Earthworks Urban Farm, which is one of the sort of more sort of deeply connected progressive organizations in Detroit. It was started in 1995 by Rick Samron, who was, at the point was a Capuchin brother. These are the guys who wear the brown robes, sort of look like Friar Tuck. And they are not monks, they're not cloistered, but they live and work among the people that they serve. And he was leaving his house, and then a boy who lived next door said, "Where are you going, brother?" And he said, "I'm going to get food." And the kid said, "Oh, what gas station do you go to?" And he recognized in there that there was a huge opportunity to work with very young people to understand some of the politics associated with both food justice, food security, and food deserts. So he started Earthworks as a sort of basically a youth outreach program. And I worked there one summer, both with students from University of Michigan and neighbors, to build this structure that's partially finished in the front row. We set up a sawmill on site, and we harvested trees from vacant lots to build that structure. The benches are built out of cob, which is basically what the Three Little Pigs had, sort of stone and mud and straw woven together to make something that has existed now for 8 years outside. And some of my favorite aspects of it were people sharing skills. So here, Becca, one of my students who is from Berkeley, who came to University of Michigan and spent the summer with us in Detroit, is teaching ukulele, but she said her ukulele skills were only sufficient to teach 3 to 4-year-olds. So there. Next slide, please. I've continued to work with Earthworks in many ways. When my family lived in that neighborhood in Detroit on the east side, we ate breakfast and lunch at the soup kitchen, which was supposed to be a temporary stopgap during the Depression, but continued, and there are many questions we can ask about why soup kitchens persist in a country as wealthy as ours. But when the first kids aged out of that program that Rick Samron started, which was called Growing Healthy Kids, when they were 11 years old, they were looking for something to do. So we started a sort of entrepreneurial arm of it that's called Youth Farm Stand. This is Tyler, who was 11 at that point, who's now 20, who's a junior at Michigan State, who is super into kale. If you've ever met an 11-year-old who's really into kale, you think, you're a neat guy. And so together we designed and built a mobile stand for his kale business. I have to say he was really crushed the first day when he came back not having sold out, because he thought everybody was going to be really into it. I also love that he was willing and interested in riding this pink bike. Next slide. Oh, I should go like that. And from my time and work at Earthworks, some of my best friends are the people I started this produce business with. This is Warren Thomas, Greg Bostich, and Keith Love. And we started a business called Food, which stood for Field of Our Dreams, and it ran from 2008 to 2011. And recognizing that there was a lot of stuff that was grown at Earthworks, but not a lot of people in that neighborhood had access to fresh produce. So we set up out of the back of my car at that point, which Keith described as the white liberal car, the red Subaru Forester with an Obama sticker on the back. And we would sell produce that we would get wholesale from the produce terminals and as much possible from what people grew in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. We met then Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm, who was really terrific, and got a $10,000 grant from the state to expand the program, and we would show up at street corners, housing projects and street corners on the east side for several years, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Next slide. After the first year of business, we were able to buy this little pickup truck that we built out, and I don't have images of it up here, but it was something we could set up really quickly into a store. And the second year, we bought an old ice cream truck and have converted it into a produce stand. For the first month of its business, it still played the ice cream song. until someone said, you know, if you play the ice cream song and people come running and they see cabbage, it's not going to go as well as you'd like it to. So we stopped playing the ice cream song. Next slide, please. From that sort of, you know, one of my big sort of communities in Detroit has been the sort of food justice and food security community. And I have sort of proceeded to meet more and more people and work in this area. This is the lunchroom at Cesar Chavez Academy in Southwest Detroit. This is a school that's predominantly populated by first-generation Mexican students who are from Jalisco and Durango. And the things that they encounter coming to the United States in this, where this is what they have for lunch, have disastrous consequences, both culturally and health. So at lunchtime, there's so much demand for the hot Cheetos that the guy who stocks the vending machine just sits there with the bags and takes the dollars like that. Next slide, please. The students lobbied their principal to do something about the food, which I thought was really amazing, and somehow they found their way to me, that yellow M has something to do with it in certain ways. But this is Yaseli, Andreas, and Diego, and they told me about this mango and stick that they always had when they were children, which was taking a fresh mango, plunging it in a wooden skewer, and peeling it with a vegetable peeler so it sort of looks like a pineapple, squeezing lime on top, and then just sort of sweet chilies on top. Next slide, please. The principal allowed us, we designed and built this stand, and we would set up once a week in the lunchroom, and we'd buy wholesale mangoes. We'd sell them for $1, we'd get them for $0.25 each, and all of the money went back into the business to fund more mangoes, more students, and it grew and grew and grew from there. Next slide. And Eastern Market Development Corporation, Eastern Market is the largest, I think the largest produce terminal in the Midwest of the United States, certainly. Found out about it and have taken it over, which is wonderful that they can incubate it and continue it. And there are 16 youth food businesses run from neighborhoods and schools across the city that continue that work, both in building the capacity of these young people to envision their lives as something that they have agency in and sort of creative control within. Next slide, please. The neighborhood where I spend most of my time and most of my work is called Brightmoor in Detroit. It's a neighborhood that in 1922, there were less than 1,000 residents, and in 1924, there were 22,000 residents. And if you can imagine how quickly it had to grow in order to accommodate migrants coming up to work in the auto industry, you may imagine how quick that housing stock rose and how quickly it has fallen as that auto industry has collapsed. But I've been working in partnership with an amazing school that was started on Waldorf principles to provide sort of a hands-on whole child education, which has atrophied in the course of state funding that has favored standardized testing. So I bring University of Michigan students in, and we meet and work and co-create projects with an amazingly charismatic high school group. And you can see these two circles are meeting each other for the first time. And what they're doing is rotating in these circles. And each minute we rotate, you meet someone else. And the questions are, how often do you think about race? How often do you think about sexual orientation? How often do you think about your physical body? And these are things that people want to talk about. And they are hard questions to contend with. But they are really the sort of the basis of our work together, is knowing people as individuals and knowing people for the multiple identities that they bring to this work. Next slide, please. And making friends. So Anne and I were talking about how you sort of measure some of these successes. And I used to think you measure them by college applications and acceptances and income. But no, I think you measure them by sustained relationships or friendships or degrees of reflection or interest. So here's Brianna and Cameron sitting together on these chairs that they made from tires culled from the neighborhood. Next slide, please. That was 3 years ago. They started a student-run project at the high school called Resource Getting Hands-On with What We Can Get Our Hands On, that started with the tire chairs, became tire ottomans that they now sell on Etsy and work in handcrafted wood signs. And they use available materials to make things so that their hands-on work continues through that class. Next slide, please. This I put in for you, Nicholas, and other printmakers. There's a dress code in the school, and if you've ever been to a place that has a dress code and makes you buy their uniforms, there's something really wrong with that. So when I was a doorman at the hotel in Philadelphia, they said, you have to wear this uniform, and you have to buy it, and we're paying you $7 an hour. And I thought, I cannot wait to get out of this racket. So here's kids who live in this neighborhood where the median household income is $11,000. They have a dress code and they have to buy their shirts, and the logo is not that interesting. So together, the group of U of M students and DCH students asked the principal if they design the logo and print the shirts, can they wear them? So first it was just Fridays, and the project started in 2012 and it continues. It's run by the students who are ninth graders when it started, and they print all the shirts for the school every day of the week, all the sports teams, as well as a number of different things in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. At any point in this, I think, what are we teaching? I always think we're not teaching screen printing or tire building. We're teaching creative confidence and capacity building, and that's my objective, and that's when I recall back to my own education. Is I learned stuff in the classroom, but I was terrified in life. And as much as we can do together to share our resources, to share our needs and our assets so that we all rise together is some of my objectives thinking about this. This is a speaker building workshop that also started about 2 years ago by a mixed group of engineering, business, and art and design students at the University of Michigan, along with Cameron and Jalen over there. This is the first speaker they designed and built, which is a styrofoam cup with a copper coil and speaker leads to it. Next slide. And it grew into that really quite handsome sort of laser cut speaker. And again, it wasn't about necessarily speaker building, but it was like, I can't believe I can do that. And it grew to this project called Spark that is the incubator for our now community-based radio station that will have a storefront presence starting this summer. So it's a group of kids who were really interested in music, listening to it, performing it, who found many sort of hands-on outlets through this type of work. Next slide, please. One group built a pizza oven, which I still can't believe that they built. It's built out of steel, which is wonderful and a problem. So it heats up really quickly, but you don't want to go near it. So once it heats up, it can churn out pizzas every minute. And you can see it down at the bottom. The students source their tomatoes and basil in the growing weather from gardens in the neighborhood, and they basically use the money to fund field trips at school. And it just looks like a big hunk of rusty steel, and they just chain it with a bike lock outside of school. And they actually hire someone now in the neighborhood who cuts down firewood with a little handsaw. But before then, one of the great things was, how do we fuel this where we can find sticks and make it happen? Next slide, please. This should be a GIF. Does it have a little thingy there? Let's see if that moves, or the budget cuts don't allow it. Ah, well. Just for a range of projects, I wanted to show you this. This is a group of students that were from public health, art and design, and business, who, talking with a number of the women who were high school students who had no sports opportunities besides cheerleading. And one of the things that they discussed was, what are the things that we can do that would be non-gender specific and everybody could participate in and wouldn't require a lot of capital? So the DCH Jump Crew started. It was something amazingly portable. You just need a rope and space, and tons of people participate in it in the hallways, and they now perform at halftime at the home basketball games, sort of displacing the cheerleaders. This is a totally lovely project that from a group of 7th grade students who are really interested in animals, and they convinced the Detroit Mounted Police to show up weekly with a horse and teach the K through 2 students about taking care of large animals. One of the things that they recognized was when you take care of something, you extend that system of nurturing into your lives. And I love that everybody's hands are up when the officer asked, did anyone have a question? And the horse is named Tiny. So the students called the project When Tiny Came to Town. Next slide, please. A project that I've been running basically with whoever's around in the summer, both my students from University of Michigan and the students who sort of hang out in the wood shop, comes from some very complex, and maybe it's the same here, but certainly in Detroit, if you do not have a car, something has failed in life. So in the city that was built by the automobile, to ride a bike is an option that is sort of last-ditch effort, unless you're like a hipster in skinny jeans and you have your fixed-gear vintage Schwinn. The first thing that we started with was these hand-built bamboo trailers, and this is Dewan and Jabril, who've graduated now, who are both carpenter's assistants. Next slide, please. And this is what we can build with bamboo, which is a hand-built bamboo bicycle trailer that we can sell for $80. And the students who build them get paid $10 to $12 an hour for building them. And we distribute them as cheaply and quickly as possible to people who need a bike to get around more like a truck. Next slide, please. In 2012, we got a whole surplus of adult industrial tricycles from a Ford plant in Cleveland who used to use the trikes to ride up and down the factory floor. And their production had got smaller. So they didn't need to use the tricycles. So they said, can you use them? So we took them all. We have a Earn a Bike program or Earn a Trike. If you go through 6 weeks where it started with me and the students who showed up. If you show up every week, we take the bike apart and we put it back together. And at the end of that time, if you've shown up every week, you get to keep it. Now, the first students who I taught teach it. They can run with it completely. So we set up in the summer in sort of these low-rise housing projects in the neighborhood and do bike repair. We just show up sit under a tree, and we have some tools and a pump and some spare tubes and a radio, and people come to hang out. So Rashawn has this paper plate on his bike, and someone was reading horoscopes from it. And his horoscope had this Latin phrase in it, a posso ad esse, from possible to actual. And he said, what does that mean? We talked about what it meant. He said, that's going to be what I say. So he wrote it on the paper plate. And I love the gesture here, but I also love the notion, from possible to actual. And he wants to be a bike mechanic, and he decided he was going to make it happen that day. Next slide, please. So some of those tricycles we can build out. So this is a cardboard recycling business in the neighborhood. There's a coffee trike that's not up here. But these are things that people who run small enterprises will call us and say, this is what I have to do. Can you build out one of the trikes to do that? And we can sell them as cheaply as possible. And then when you ride it down the street, people go, what the heck is that? And where did you get it? Next slide. But this is an entirely speculative project that a group of the kids wanted to build. This is, they call it Boom Cycle. And it's got a bunch of old school boom boxes up on the top, and you tune them all to the same radio station and you ride down the street. This is, for better or for worse, at MOCAD, the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, which invited them to show their bikes 2 summers ago. Next slide, please. This is getting in the way. It's a little cut off over there by the budget cut screen, being a little different. In the Roosevelt era, in the Works Progress Administration, there was an amazing amount of federal attention given to rebuilding our infrastructure through roads, through bridges, and also through the arts. And it's an amazingly optimistic period for me to think about that the work of the artist was valued alongside that of the road worker or the bridge builder. And I often look at this project, this is in Flint in 1939, wondering if the guys who are working on the road are sort of pissed off at the guy who's drawing over there, or vice versa, or if there's some real utility of people as artists doing their work publicly for one another to see. Now, there should be a video coming up, and if it doesn't work, we'll do that funny thing. That doesn't look good, but yeah. All right. You know what? Let's just skip that one. And if this doesn't work, then we're going to do that funny thing again. All right, that's not moving either. All right, so pause that. And this will be the last thing I show, and I'll just preface it. This is a special Milwaukee gesture for all of you. You can hit escape, and then we'll go just straight out of the PowerPoint. I heard that they're building a light rail in Milwaukee. Is that correct? And where is it? Downtown. It's not a light rail. Downtown. And it's Disney for the rich people. All right, so in Detroit, there's this thing called the People Mover. Has anyone seen RoboCop or the People Mover? So it's this totally preposterous elevated rail system that was built in 1987, and I think it was actually $300 million. It was a huge misuse of Department of Transportation funding. And the promise of it initially was suburbanites could come in and park in secure garages, take the People Mover. They wouldn't have to descend and touch the city, but they could go into their offices in the Renaissance Center, which was then the GM headquarters. The other promise was that this is just the start of a citywide mass transit system, and the next part is coming. So here we are in 2015, it still hasn't come. This fall, the state of Michigan broke ground on the Woodward M1 rail that was going to be a mass transit hub, starting with downtown and extending to the rest of the city at a cost of $700 million. Detroit is 139 square miles. Most of it is completely underserved by public transit. And so you may ask yourselves, I hope you do, why are you putting all this resource in the same place where you've already put it before? So I worked with a group of my friends and students, as well as a neighborhood organization called Building Movement, and we start our train at the spot where the light rail will never get to, just where it stops. So I'm going to help make it happen, and you can, I think that might be it. That's where the light rail is supposed to go, down the middle of the street. Thank you guys so much.